The issue of expensive drugs is simply not going to go away. It's becoming an even greater political topic again as we move away from the pandemic. How can you justify the high costs of your drugs?
It's a contentious issue. So I start from the other end. The Inflation Reduction Act under Biden has now, for the first time, highlighted 10 drugs that are under scrutiny and for which the government is no longer prepared to pay the prices. To me, that's a starting point for more to come. And it started really with Clinton, but they didn't get the right policies through, but Biden's picked it up. And now with this act, he's got a real tool to lower the prices of these expensive drugs. And that will also follow in Europe. On the other side, and I want to quote one of the renowned leaders of NICE, the former executive, Sir Andrew Dillon, who said something, actually he wrote it to the Times 7 years ago. He said, if these drug companies continue to develop drugs for an average of $1.2 million per treatment and seek returns from us, then come again. We will not be the agency that gives the returns. So with that in mind, and carefully listening and seeing what's happening in the environment, the art and the skill is then to lower your fixed costs and make sure that you are able to develop these drugs at a fraction of the price. And we did that at 16% of the median. So we spent 16% of what is usual in the industry. And for that, you now have a financial proof of principle. You can do it. And you do that by integrating all the skill sets and functions in-house rather than a company that outsources everything. But you need to spend 10, 12 years to develop a drug. And you need to manage the risks of phase 1, 2, and 3, and the regulatory risk, which is the ultimate decision maker to allow a drug to come to market or not. And the 3 most expensive words in our industry is one more trial. When you think you're at the finishing line and the regulatory agency tells you one more trial, you are another few $100 million further. So in order to avoid these 3 words, you do everything beforehand to make sure that you stand a more than reasonable chance, I would say 60 to 70% in a phase 3 to make it. As I said before, you also need to know whether the drug is reimbursable. Because if you get all these signs and indications through your market research that insurers and payors are not going to entertain this drug on their list, you better abandon the program, even if your drug is effective, because you will have a tragedy at the end. So on average, a patient costs about $42,000 for a trial of a year and more. That's a US number. In dermatology, it's about $25,000 per patient. In brain disorders, it's about $42,000 per patient. And you need to understand that you're also competing with other firms for these patients in clinical trials, because there's a limited number of patients. So you need to be wise of how you go about these clinical trials, how you conduct it, and how you enter these most expensive clinical trials, which is the pivotal phase 3s at the end. And we do that by proof of principles with smaller trials, more data points per patient, smaller number of patients, saving these patients for phase 3, and then the risk is lower. So economically, you can justify the upfront costs, the development costs, and the total investment for your shareholders if you internally have all the indications that you stand a 60 to 70% chance of getting it to the finishing line, save for the insurance verdict at the end that you need to gauge really early on. Mm-hmm. And that is more or less the total package that we handle. That is different than a large pharmaceutical company that's actually opening their suite of R&D possibilities and discover at the end whether a drug is able to compete on pricing or not. And so that is, I think, the differentiating factor with CLINUVEL.
Now, the share price has been under pressure, particularly in the summer of 2023. What accounts for that, would you say? Why have we seen these declines?
Well, there are a number of factors, and it needs deep analysis on the share price decline of CLINUVEL. The wider market, and I'm looking always at the indices, so the Nasdaq Biotech Index has lost about 30%. So we are not alone, we are part of a sell-off by major institutions worldwide, and there is no reason why CLINUVEL would not be sensitive and prone to that kind of decline. In the Australian market, we've seen a number of larger companies. I can think of ResMed, one of the most successful companies in Australia, that has lost 36% since July. The paradox in CLINUVEL is that we are growing year on year. We last month showed over 30% growth in profits after tax, and you don't expect such a stark decline and sell-off then. There are those in a fairly low traded stock that take profits immediately after the results published. But by and large, I think there's much more of a systemic effect than the valuation of the company on fundamentals. And so we have been growing over the last 7 years, both revenues and profits, a CAGR of about 30% year on year. Our PE ratio has hovered around 25 to 30, which is around the median in pharmaceuticals. So on its fundamentals, my belief is that the stock will rebound back to the highs that we've seen in the past, because the company is stronger than it was when it commanded PE values of 30 and 40. At the peak of the market, the company was worth 2.2 billion on no news flow and quite a weak balance sheet. So the paradox couldn't be starker, and therefore we are not so concerned about it, but we do feel the pain for our shareholders.
Do you think it is anything to do with where you're listed as well? Do you think you're more sensitive to fluctuations in appetite?
Well, that's a very pertinent question. Is this the right environment and market for this company? Or is it time to migrate the company to the US? Now, I've said in public that the 8 life science companies that migrated from the ASX to Nasdaq, the 8 life science companies, have done abysmally poorly in the US, losing value for shareholders, diluting their shareholders, because they needed to create liquidity for the US institutions to come in. So we would be, if we were to decide, the number 9 making the transition to the US. However, a company that would not need the funding from US investors with the cash surplus. And in my view, it would need to be on the basis of a US-centric activity. And our revenues, or 50% of our revenues, are coming from the US already. A third of our registry is US-based. And I believe the final piece of the puzzle is actually to find technologies or companies that are complementary that would facilitate our listing in the US. So is it coming, is the question, or is Australia going to give proper value to the company? And at the same time, you also need to be cognizant of the fact that a third of our registry are Australians, and you do not wish to have abrupt events such that they will put their shares on the market. So it's maneuvering the tension between two, but it's clear that if we internally as a board and management believe that we remain undervalued, that at some point we will need to take action.
What do you think, though, that the long-term impact will be on capital markets if NASDAQ and S&P suck away the most successful companies from other countries?
Well, domestically, it's sad. We're one of the better stories in Australia. So I'm very conscious of the fact that these capital markets helped you to get to this point, and you do not want to pull the rug under the feet of the Australians. And there's a real pride for this company in the US. It's a son company in Australia. And so my view is, when the timing is right, and when you have all the evidence gathered that the Australian markets are not giving you the value that you think the company is commanding, and if there is an arbitrage with the US, then you have no choice than going to the US.
Can you see that there'll be a situation emerging in the future when other exchanges are like feeder schools for the great New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ?
Well, they're a bit more skeptical. I think the US market will always be the main market for life sciences, since the depth of the market is so great. And you need to look at the specialist funds, the number of sell-side analysts, and there is no other market at the moment that can compete with the US. So I believe that the US market will be always, or for a long term foreseen, the market for life science companies. Yeah.
We had a surge of interest in investing during the pandemic among younger investors around the world. Do you think that message that you should invest for the long term has got through to this new era of investors? Or do you think there needs to be a greater communication about how you should invest over the long term? And that could benefit, of course, then the pharmaceutical industry, couldn't it? Because this kind of switching and ditching stocks, looking for short-term returns, just doesn't marry with what the pharmaceutical industry does.
You need to characterize the investors that you attract. And I think we attract long-term investors. With that comes also the impatience. 10, 15 years, is it reasonable to ask investors to stay so long in the company, or is it really an investment for their next of kin? I believe that our sector attracts very different investors, those that understand that the upside is so high that you can actually, with the winners, make a 3, 5, 10-fold return on your initial investor. So I think that the education is quite in order, certainly in the US. People understand the sector, they understand the risk, and they're prepared to wait for it. In Australia, it's a bit different because we operating in a market that is more known for its investments in resources, utilities, and life sciences is not the flavor of the month. And so there you need education. But that comes also from the sell-side analysts that you attract. These are specialists in the field, and they are eventually the conduits, the messengers to their clientele. So I'm pretty optimistic that the long-termers, certainly in our case, will be handsomely rewarded.
Great. So what do you think the prospects are then for revenue growth going forward?
Well, we don't give guidance to markets, but there is nothing that stands in the way of, and that is how far the horizon goes for the next 3 years of continued growth in revenues and profits. So we've grown in revenues about average 30% per annum, net profit after tax between 20 and 30%. And so we prepare the company for that linear growth that will enable us to expand organically and inorganically. So there is no factor that we've seen so far that makes us less optimistic on the continued growth of this company. And the resources that come with it, the net profit, is going to be replowed in both the pharmaceutical domain and in the photocosmetics, the markets that we develop.
And a big chunk of that will have to go on marketing and your new strategies as well, I assume.
Well, that's an excellent question, because we're one of the very few companies that is actually building an agency in-house, a communication, branding and marketing agency within this conglomerate. And there's a good reason, because we believe that the people who are going to execute and establish these new markets need to have knowledge about the products, the origin, the technologies, and there's no better way to do that than having the in-house team yourself rather than relying on external parties like WPP or Ogilvy. And so we are establishing our own branding, marketing, and the communications teams in-house. And so the funding that goes towards marketing to establish these new markets is higher than we've ever spent, but reasonably modest compared to launching a new product by an established cosmetic houses. And that is because we're using different channels, different models, and direct digital marketing to the target populations that we seek.
So there will be a limit to payouts then going forward because of this need to reinvest in marketing, but also R&D?
Well, the redistribution of profits is a hot topic. I believe, certainly in our case, where 35% of our members, shareholders, have been there for the entire journey of 17 years, that you need to continue the gesture of issuing dividends year on year. So that the redistribution of funds is quite important in how you do that. The common theme and question that we ask is this company going to engage in share buybacks? And there are a number of criteria that make you think about that notion of share buybacks in pharmaceuticals. And it would benefit all shareholders and also us as executive managers. But the notion of using your profits for a temporary increase in share price or EPS, in my view, is for a number of reasons flawed. And for one of them is that the reimbursement agencies, the payors, will look at your surplus cash that you give back to shareholders, and that is not well received. So that will eventually lead to lower drug prices. So the public demonstration of share buybacks by pharmaceutical companies, certainly at our stage, in my view, is not
A direction of
favorable.
travel.
No.